The mansion stood on a quiet hill, far away from the noise of the city, surrounded by tall gates and perfectly trimmed gardens. Yet despite its beauty, it felt cold and empty, like a place where happiness had been forgotten. The billionaire who owned it had everything money could buy: luxury cars, expensive art, and a powerful name in the business world. But inside his heart, there was a silence that no amount of wealth could fill. Ever since the tragic accident that left his father paralyzed, his life had completely changed. His father was once a strong and respected man, full of energy and wisdom, the kind of person who could light up a room with his presence. But now he lay on a bed in one of the largest rooms in the mansion, unable to move, unable to speak, and barely able to react to anything around him. Every morning, the billionaire would walk past his father's room, pausing for just a moment at the door, looking inside with a heavy expression. The machines around the bed made soft beeping sounds, reminding him that his father was alive, but it didn't feel like living. Doctors from around the world had been called. Specialists, therapists, and caregivers had all tried their best, but nothing worked. Each one gave the same answer in different words, that there was little hope for recovery. And, over time, the billionaire stopped believing in miracles. The staff in the mansion moved quietly, speaking in low voices as if they were afraid to disturb the sadness that filled the walls. No laughter was ever heard, no music played, and even the sunlight that entered through the large windows seemed dull and lifeless. The billionaire rarely spoke to anyone unless it was about work. He buried himself in meetings, calls, and endless business deals, using his work as a way to escape the pain he felt inside. He convinced himself that staying busy was the only way to survive. At night, the mansion became even more silent. The long hallways echoed with emptiness, and the billionaire often found himself unable to sleep. He would walk alone, sometimes stopping outside his father's room again. But he never entered, not anymore. It was too painful to see the man who once guided him now lying still, like a shadow of his former self. He remembered the days when his father would give him advice, laugh with him, and teach him lessons about life and strength. Those memories felt distant now, like they belonged to another lifetime. Sometimes he wondered if his father could still hear him, if somewhere deep inside, there was still awareness, but the fear of not getting any response kept him away. He chose silence instead, the same silence that had taken over the mansion, turning it into a place of routine rather than life. Every day felt the same: waking up, working, avoiding emotions, and going back to bed with the same emptiness. The caregivers did their duties with professionalism, feeding the father, adjusting the machines, and making sure everything was in place. But to them, it was just a job. None of them stayed long, because the atmosphere of the house was too heavy, too depressing. It felt like time had stopped inside those walls, like nothing would ever change. The billionaire often stood by the large window in his office, looking out at the city far away, watching people live their lives, laughing, struggling, moving forward, while he felt stuck, trapped in a moment that refused to pass. He had achieved everything he once dreamed of, yet none of it mattered anymore, because the one person he wanted to share it with was no longer truly there. Deep down, he had started to accept that this was his reality. A life filled with success on the outside and emptiness on the inside. A home that looked perfect to the world but felt broken within. He stopped hoping for change, stopped believing that anything or anyone could bring warmth back into the mansion, and without realizing it, he had built walls not just around his house, but around his heart as well. Walls so strong that even the smallest sign of hope could not pass through them. Or, at least, that's what he believed, until something unexpected was about to enter his life and quietly challenge everything he thought he knew. The new maid arrived on a quiet afternoon, when the mansion felt heavier than usual, as if even the air had grown tired of carrying silence. Her name was Amina, and she stood at the large gate holding a small, worn-out bag. Her clothes were simple but clean, and her eyes carried a mix of nervousness and quiet determination. She had traveled far to get this job, not for comfort, but for survival. Back in her small neighborhood, life had never been easy, and this opportunity, no matter how intimidating, felt like a door she could not afford to ignore. As she stepped inside the mansion for the first time, she was overwhelmed by its size and beauty. The shining floors, the tall ceilings, the expensive decorations, everything looked like something out of a dream. Yet something felt off. There was no warmth, no sound of laughter, no sense of life. It was beautiful, but it felt empty, like a place where people existed but did not truly live. She noticed how the staff avoided eye contact, how how their footsteps were slow and quiet, and how every movement seemed controlled, as if they were all afraid of breaking an invisible rule. Amina quickly understood that this was not an ordinary house, and this was not an ordinary job. She was given simple instructions: clean the rooms, assist when needed, and most importantly, do not interfere with anything related to the owner's father. The warning was clear, almost strict, but it only made her more curious. She had seen suffering before. She had taken care of her own sick mother for years before she passed away, and something in her heart always pulled her toward those who were helpless. On her second day, while cleaning the hallway, she passed by a large door that was slightly open. She paused for a moment, hearing the faint sound of machines from inside. Slowly, she glanced through the gap and saw the old man lying on the bed, surrounded by medical equipment, his body still, his face calm but lifeless. It was a sight that made her chest tighten, not out of fear, but out of sadness. She stood there longer than she should have, observing him carefully, as if trying to understand something deeper than what was visible. From that moment, something changed in her routine. While the other staff members rushed through their tasks, eager to finish and leave, Amina began finding small reasons to pass by that room. Sometimes she would quietly stand near the door. Sometimes she would step inside when no one was around. She never touched anything, never broke any rules. She simply watched, her eyes focused on the old man's face, looking for any sign of life, any small movement that others might have missed. Days passed, and while nothing obvious changed, Amina felt something unusual. There were moments when she thought she saw a slight flicker in his eyes, or a tiny shift in his fingers, so small that anyone else would ignore it. But to her, it felt important. She had spent years caring for someone who could not always speak or move, and she had learned that sometimes, the smallest reactions carried the biggest meaning. One evening, while dusting a nearby table, she noticed that a soft melody was playing from a device in the corner of the room. It was slow and gentle, almost like a lullaby. She glanced at the old man again, and for a brief second, she felt as if his eyes were not as empty as before. Her heart skipped. She leaned slightly closer, trying to confirm what she had seen. But the moment passed, and everything returned to stillness. That night, she could not stop thinking about it. Lying on her small bed in the staff quarters, she replayed the moment again and again in her mind, questioning herself, wondering if it was just her imagination. But deep inside, she felt certain that there was something more, something hidden beneath the silence, something waiting to be awakened. The next day, she found herself drawn to the room again. But this time, she did not just stand and watch. She stayed longer, observing the rhythm of the machines, the stillness of the body, and the quiet space that surrounded him. She whispered softly, not expecting an answer, just offering a presence that felt human. Something warm in a place that had forgotten warmth. Unknown to her, her small actions were the beginning of something that would slowly disturb the stillness of the mansion. Something that would challenge the beliefs of everyone in that house, especially the billionaire who had long given up hope, because while others saw a lifeless man on a bed, Amina saw something different, something unfinished, and she was not the kind of person who walked away from something that still had a chance, no matter how small it seemed. The evening had settled quietly over the mansion, wrapping it in its usual blanket of silence. But this time, something was different. Something subtle yet powerful was about to break the routine that had not changed for months. The billionaire returned home earlier than expected that day. His mind tired from endless meetings, his face carrying the same cold expression he had learned to wear. He walked through the grand entrance, barely noticing the staff greeting him. His thoughts were elsewhere, as always. As he moved down the long hallway, loosening his tie, he suddenly paused. There was a sound, faint but unfamiliar. It was not the usual mechanical beeping or the quiet footsteps of the staff. It was something softer, something almost musical. He frowned slightly, trying to understand what he was hearing. The sound seemed to be coming from his father's room, a place where nothing ever changed, a place that had become a symbol of stillness and silence. Curiosity mixed with irritation began to rise inside him. No one was allowed to disturb that room unnecessarily, especially not in a way that broke the strict atmosphere he had maintained. His steps grew sharper as he walked toward the door. The sound became clearer now, a gentle melody, slow and emotional, the kind of music that carried feeling in every note. His hand reached for the door, and without hesitation, he pushed it open. What he saw in that moment made him freeze, his breath caught, and for a second, he could not understand what was happening. There, in the center of the room, stood Amina, the quiet maid, moving gracefully to the soft music. Her steps were slow and careful, her arms flowing gently through the air. Her movements were not random. They were controlled, expressive, almost as if she was telling a story without words. Her eyes were not on the door, not on anything around her. They were focused entirely on the old man lying on the bed. The billionaire's expression quickly shifted from shock to anger. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched to him. This looked completely inappropriate, even disrespectful. How could a maid turn such a serious and painful situation into something like this? How could she behave as if this room was a stage instead of a place of suffering? But before he could speak, something else caught his attention. Something he had not seen in a very long time. His father's eyes. They were not completely still. They seemed to be following the movement, just slightly, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make him hesitate. His anger paused for a brief second as confusion took its place. He stepped closer. His eyes fixed on the bed now, watching carefully. Amina continued dancing, unaware of his presence. Her movements gentle and full of emotion, as if she was trying to reach something deep inside the old man. Something hidden beyond the silence. The music played softly in the background, filling the room with a feeling that had been absent for too long. Something warm, something human. Then it happened, so small, so quick, yet impossible to ignore. The old man's finger moved, just a tiny twitch, but it was real. The billionaire's eyes widened. His heart started beating faster. He had spent months, countless days, hoping for any sign. And now, in the middle of something he did not understand, he was seeing it with his own eyes. "Stop this right now." His voice suddenly broke through the moment, sharp and commanding. Amina froze instantly, her body stiffening as she turned toward him, her face pale with surprise. She had not expected anyone to see her, especially not him. The music continued for a second before she quickly turned it off, the room falling back into silence. The billionaire stepped forward, his anger returning, but now mixed with something else, something he could not fully explain. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice cold, yet slightly shaken. Amina lowered her eyes for a moment, but there was no fear in her expression, only calmness, as if she believed in what she had been doing. "I was trying to help," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Help?" he repeated, disbelief clear in his tone. "By dancing?" She nodded slightly, her eyes now meeting his. "He reacts to it?" she said. "I've seen it, small movements, changes in his eyes. It may not seem like much, but it's something." The billionaire glanced at his father again, his mind racing, trying to process everything. Part of him wanted to reject what he had just witnessed, to believe it was nothing, just a coincidence, but another part of him, a part he had buried long ago, felt a spark of something unfamiliar, hope. The room stood still once again, but this time, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It carried a question, a possibility, something that could not be easily ignored, and for the first time in a long time, the billionaire found himself unsure of what to believe, because what he had just seen challenged everything he thought he knew, and deep down, it scared him just as much as it gave him hope. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. The music had stopped, the movement had ended, but the tension in the room only grew stronger. The billionaire stood still for a moment, trying to control the storm of emotions rising inside him. Anger, confusion, disbelief, and something else he refused to accept so easily, hope. His expression hardened again as he took a step closer, his voice sharp and controlled. "Do you even understand where you are?" he said, his eyes fixed on Amina. "This is not some place for experiments or performances." The last word came out with clear disapproval, as if he could not even accept what he had just witnessed. Amina did not step back. She remained where she was, her posture calm, her face serious. She understood his anger. She expected it, but she was not ashamed. "I know exactly where I am," she replied softly yet firmly. "And I know what I saw." "What you saw?" he repeated, his tone rising slightly. "You saw nothing? Doctors have tried everything. Specialists from all over the world have given up. And you think you can change something by dancing?" His words were harsh, filled with frustration that had been building for months. maybe even years. It was not just about her actions. It was about the pain he had been carrying, the helplessness he had refused to face, and now her presence was forcing him to confront it. Amina took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, she said, it's not about doing something big. Sometimes it's about doing something human. Her voice remained gentle, but there was strength in it, a quiet confidence that did not match her position as a maid. He scoffed slightly, turning his gaze away for a second, as if trying to distance himself from her words, but they lingered in his mind. You think I haven't tried everything human? He said, his voice lower now, more personal. I've spent millions, I've brought the best people here, and nothing changed. Amina looked at the old man on the bed, her eyes softening. They treated him like a case, she said. Not like a person. That sentence hit differently. It was simple, but it carried a truth the billionaire had never allowed himself to think about. He remained silent for a moment, his eyes slowly moving back to his father, the machines, the stillness, the emptiness of the room. I noticed something, Amina continued, taking a small step forward. When there is music, his eyes react, not always, not clearly, but it's there, and when I move, when I try to express something, it feels like he is trying to follow, like something inside him is still awake. The billionaire clenched his jaw, his mind replaying what he had seen earlier, that tiny movement, that brief moment that refused to leave his thoughts. He wanted to deny it, to protect himself from disappointment, but it was becoming harder to ignore. And what if you're wrong? He asked, his voice quieter now, but still guarded. What if this is just your imagination? Amina did not hesitate. Then I lose nothing, she said. But if I'm right, even a little, then he gains something. Even a small chance is still a chance. Her words filled the room with a different kind of silence, one that made the billionaire uncomfortable because deep inside, he knew he had stopped believing in chances a long time ago. He had accepted defeat without saying it out loud, and now this woman, someone with nothing, was standing in front of him, refusing to give up on something he had already let go. He walked slowly toward the window, running a hand through his hair, trying to think clearly. His emotions were no longer as controlled as they usually were. He felt exposed, uncertain, something he hated. Why? He finally asked, without turning back. Why are you doing this? Amina looked down for a moment, then answered honestly. Because I've seen people come back from silence before, she said. Not completely, not always, but enough to feel, enough to connect, and no one deserves to be left alone inside their own body. The words were not dramatic, but they carried weight. They came from experience, from pain, from something real, and the billionaire could feel that. He turned back slowly, his expression no longer filled with anger, but with something more complicated, something uncertain. He looked at his father again, then at Amina, standing there with nothing but belief in her eyes. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice calmer, yet still firm. You will not do anything without my permission, he said. And everything you do, I will be watching. Amina nodded quietly, understanding the condition. She did not argue, did not push further. For her, this was enough. The billionaire took one last look at his father before walking out of the room. But this time, his steps were slower, his mind heavier, yet strangely lighter in a way he could not explain, because for the first time in a long time, there was a question in his heart instead of an answer, and that question refused to let him return to the same silence he had been living in for so long. The next morning felt different, though nothing in the mansion had visibly changed. The same quiet hallways, the same soft footsteps, the same controlled routine. Yet something unseen had shifted, like a small crack in a wall that had stood strong for too long. The billionaire woke up earlier than usual, his mind restless, replaying every moment from the previous night, the movement of his father's finger, Amina's calm voice, the possibility he had tried so hard to deny. He stood by the window for a while, looking out at the distant city, but his thoughts were not on business anymore. They kept returning to that room, to that moment, and without fully realizing it. He found himself walking toward his father's room earlier than he ever had before, his steps slow, almost hesitant, as if he was not ready for what he might see, or what he might feel. When he reached the door, he paused, taking a deep breath before opening it slightly. Inside, the room looked the same, the machines quietly doing their job, his father lying still, and Amina standing near the side, adjusting something on the table. She noticed him immediately but did not speak. She simply stepped aside, giving him space, respecting the distance he still needed. For a moment, nothing happened, the silence returned, almost mocking the hope that had begun to grow. The billionaire felt a familiar frustration rise inside him. Maybe it had all been nothing. Maybe he had allowed himself to believe something that was not real. But then Amina quietly reached for the small device and played the same soft music from the night before. The gentle melody filled the room again, slow, emotional, almost like a whisper meant only for the soul. She did not look at the billionaire. She focused only on the old man, and after a brief pause, she began to move again, her steps careful, her movements full of feeling, not as a performance, but as a message, something deeper than words. The billionaire watched closely, his eyes fixed on his father, searching for any sign, any proof that this was not just a meaningless act. Seconds passed, then more, and just when doubt began to return, it happened again, a small movement, the slightest twitch in his father's hand, followed by a faint shift in his eyes. This time, it was clearer, undeniable. The billionaire stepped closer, his heart beating faster, his breath slightly uneven. He leaned in, watching every detail, afraid to miss anything. "Did you see that?" Amina whispered softly, not turning her head, her voice filled with quiet certainty. He did not respond immediately, his eyes still locked on his father. Then slowly, almost in disbelief, he nodded. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to unfold. It was not dramatic, not a sudden recovery, but small, consistent changes, the kind that could easily be ignored by someone who was not paying attention. But now, the billionaire was watching everything, every movement, every reaction, every tiny sign of life. Amina continued her routine, playing the music, moving gently, sometimes speaking softly to the old man, telling him simple things, stories, memories, as if he could hear and understand every word, and slowly, the responses became more frequent. A slight turn of the head, a longer gaze, even a tear that rolled down his cheek during one of the sessions. That tear changed everything. The billionaire saw it clearly, and this time, he could not hold back his emotions. He stepped out of the room quickly, running a hand over his face, trying to process what he had just witnessed. It was something he had waited for, something he had almost stopped believing in. The mansion began to feel different. The staff noticed it too. The silence was no longer as heavy. There was a sense of movement, of something changing. Whispers of hope began to spread, something that had not existed in that house for a long time. The billionaire himself began to change, though slowly. He started spending more time in the room, sometimes sitting quietly, sometimes speaking to his father, unsure if he was being heard, but no longer afraid to try. The distance he had created was beginning to break, piece by piece. One evening, as Amina finished her gentle movements and turned off the music, the billionaire spoke, his voice softer than it had ever been before. "How did you know?" Amina looked at him, a faint, tired smile on her face. "I didn't know," she said. "I just believed there was something left." He nodded slowly, looking at his father again. His eyes no longer filled with emptiness, but with something new, something fragile yet powerful, hope. And as he stood there, watching the man he had almost lost respond in the smallest ways, he realized something that no amount of money or power had ever taught him. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest actions, and sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who bring life back into places that felt completely lost. The changes in the mansion were no longer small or hidden. They were real, visible, and impossible to ignore. What had once been a place filled with silence and routine had slowly begun to breathe again. The air felt lighter. The staff no longer walked as if they were carrying an invisible weight, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of anticipation in the halls, as if everyone was quietly waiting for something more to happen, something even greater. The old man's condition continued to improve, not in a dramatic, miraculous way, but in steady, meaningful steps. His eyes followed movement more clearly now, his fingers responded more often, and sometimes, when Amina spoke, there was a faint change in his expression, as if he was trying to remember, trying to return. Each small sign felt like a victory, not just for him, but for everyone who had started to believe again. The billionaire had changed the most, though he would never openly admit it. The cold distance he once carried had begun to fade. replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. He now spent hours in his father's room, sometimes sitting quietly, sometimes speaking about his day, about the business, about memories from the past, things he had buried deep inside himself. It was as if he was slowly rebuilding a connection he thought was lost forever. But the biggest moment came on an evening that seemed ordinary at first. The sky outside was turning orange as the sun began to set, casting a soft glow through the large windows. Amina had just started the music, her movements as gentle and meaningful as always. The billionaire stood nearby, watching, not with doubt anymore, but with quiet hope. Then suddenly, something happened that made time feel like it had stopped. The old man's hand moved more than it ever had before. Not just a twitch, but a slow, deliberate movement. His fingers curling slightly as if trying to reach out. The billionaire froze, his eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. "Father?" he whispered, stepping closer. His voice trembling in a way it never had before. Amina stopped moving, her eyes fixed on the old man, her heart racing. The room fell into a deep silence. But this time, it was not empty. It was filled with something powerful, something alive. The old man's eyes shifted, slowly but clearly, until they met his son's face. It was brief, just a few seconds. But in those seconds, everything changed. There was recognition, there was awareness, there was life. Tears filled the billionaire's eyes as he dropped to his knees beside the bed, holding his father's hand carefully, as if afraid the moment would disappear if he moved too quickly. "I'm here," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I'm right here." A single tear rolled down the old man's cheek again. But this time, it felt different. It was not just a reaction. It felt like a response, like something deep inside him had finally found its way back. Days later, doctors were called again, the same experts who had once given up, but now, their expressions were filled with surprise and disbelief. They examined the old man carefully, running tests, observing every detail, and one by one, they admitted what they could not deny. There was progress, real, unexplainable progress. That was when the truth about Amina came fully into the light. Not through her, but through someone who had known her past. She had once been trained in therapeutic movement and emotional rehabilitation, working with patients who had lost their ability to respond, using music, rhythm, and human connection to reach parts of the mind that medicine alone could not touch. But life had not been kind to her. Poverty, family struggles, and loss had forced her to leave that world behind, pushing her into a life where her skills were hidden, unrecognized. When the billionaire learned this, he was stunned, not just by her past, but by what it meant. She had walked into his home as a maid, someone the world would overlook, yet she carried something more valuable than anything he had ever paid for. Something real, something powerful. He called her to his office one evening, the same office where he had spent years building his empire. But this time, the conversation was different. His voice was calm, his expression sincere. "You didn't just help my father," he said. "You brought him back to us." Amina lowered her eyes slightly, as she always did. But there was a quiet pride in her heart, not for recognition, but for what she had been able to do. "I want to change your life the way you changed ours," he continued. "Not as a reward, but because you deserve it." What he offered her was more than money, more than comfort. He offered her a chance to return to the work she had been forced to leave, to rebuild her future, to use her gift in a way that could help many others. And at the same time, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He chose to create a space within his own world where care, compassion, and human connection would matter just as much as power and success. The mansion was no longer silent. It had found its voice again, not through wealth or status, but through something far more meaningful. And as the billionaire stood beside his father, watching him slowly return to life, he understood a truth he had never seen before, that sometimes, the most shocking changes do not come from power or money, but from the quiet strength of someone who refuses to give up on what the world has already forgotten.